the focus is teaching these, principles of natural law. And I think the reason that they're interesting, if you are committed to creating a life that is fulfilling for yourself, I think understanding how things work is going to be a shortcut, rather than banging your head against the wall and going like, why can I not make this happen? What's the deal here? And I find this stuff fascinating because I really believe that our lives are about creation. That we, of all species, have the consciousness to choose what we want to do in life, as opposed to most animals. I think they're primarily instinctual. There's some variance, I guess, in their behavior. I don't study animals that much, and they have personality, and if they have a soul, it's a different sort of quality of soul than we have. We have the ability to know and implement and imagine things, and so I think it's really fascinating to study oneself as a human being and then go, okay, what am I going to do here while I'm on the earth? So understanding the principles that govern creation, energy, if you're into God, etc., gives you the tools to implement, and it's very empowering versus what a lot of people have just sort of fallen into, which is a kind of a victim mentality, just disappointed with the difficulties of their upbringing and the challenges of finding a partner, and then the challenges of being in a union, and challenges of the kind of work they've been able to manifest, and how much money they have, and if their kids pursue the path that is satisfying to them, etc., etc. And the more you understand the principles, the more detached in a healthy way you get, the sort of the Buddhist perspective on detachment, which is definitely exerting energy and care towards that which you desire, but not being attached to whether those desires come into the manifestation exactly as you have determined that you want. So today we're going to talk about two principles which are relatively simple, and then I want to provide some instruction on how to improve one's ability to work within the parameters of these principles. And in fact, what's cool is that the second principle, the principle of rhythm, we're going to talk about, is something that with consciousness you can essentially, I don't know if I'd say overcome, I'm trying to think of what the word is. That, here's an example. There was a period in my spiritual journey when I was doing psychic readings. This was sometime in the 90s when I was reading Tarot, and I was fascinated with the philosophy of the Tarot. It's actually just a really holistic and brilliant, especially the major arcana. If you see how it's all laid out in a chart, everything is connected and it's beautiful the way the numbers line up and the principles. It's relatively easy to predict somebody's future when there's a sense that their consciousness is not active in taking responsibility. Because typically history will tend to repeat itself. The principles, the beliefs that exist within ourselves, if we are not examining them, they will pretty much automatically lead to thought processes, emotional processes, behavioral tendencies, actions, and therefore what we have created up to this point will tend to be what we continue to create. And so there's a certain element of providing, psychic counseling that is relatively easy because people are not proactive in using the tools that we have to define our future, as opposed to just going, well, it's fate, so this is going to happen. And there's a certain type of psychic that does really well in being able to say, oh, I see you on a plane and you'll meet a handsome stranger and all this kind of stuff. That was never the kind of psychic work that I did, because I always believed in the power to create the future, that you were not destined to have a certain future unless there was no active consciousness in terms of examining, how you were creating. What was your belief system that was leading to the choices that you made that then turned out to be the manifestations of that which you experienced. Okay, so I'm going to provide some instruction on how to improve dramatically the chances and the reality of manifesting, exactly what you want within, I don't like the word within the confines, but within the existence of reality. Now, I'm a believer that in God all things are possible. But I don't necessarily believe that through my mind I can manifest, like, oh, I want a dog in the room and boom, it's just going to show up. Like, I'm not saying that's impossible, but I don't have the skills to do that, and I don't think I'm going to develop those in this lifetime where I can just make matter move at that velocity. I can just manifest a living creature. But I do believe that pretty much anything that you conceive of is possible. And I've always wanted to become a master of that because I just think it's so fascinating. And as I've matured, when I was younger, I wanted to manifest things that were primarily for my own benefit. And through surrendering to the path, I have enough wealth that I can live relatively comfortably. So the focus becomes, how can I be of the most use on the planet for other people? And that tends to provide the greatest feeling of joy and fulfillment. Okay, so the principle of polarity is simply that what we perceive as two poles of a particular thing are actually just varying degrees of that thing. So if we think about hot and cold, we'll think of that as being opposites. In reality, they're just different degrees of temperature. And there's no real point where you can say, we can say, right around this point is when things change from being hot to being cold. But in relationship to other things, that may not be the case. Like, for example, if you touch the hot element of the stove, you might go, well, that's really hot. In comparison to the surface of the sun, it's really not that hot at all. And the same thing exists on sort of emotional scales. Like somebody might say, well, that person is very emotional in how they deal with things, and this other person is very rational. And both are different ways of perceiving their experience, and there's a certain point where it's sort of a gray area. Well, would you call this person rational, or would you call them emotional? So you could take a lot of different things and begin to recognize that what we think of as opposites are just varying degrees of the same thing. It's helpful. The only reason I think this is helpful, because I was meditating on this going like, well, why does this really matter? It's kind of cool, I guess, to go like, oh yeah, like there's no real sense of opposites. There's just varying degrees on a scale of something. I think it's helpful when we turning our discussion to the idea of being able to actively manifest the things that you seek. That a lot of times what gets in the way are concepts that we have. One of them that came up to me in the meditation was one's tolerance. How much tolerance do I have for discomfort? Because the process of transformation typically begins with a desire for something that I do not yet have. That leads to a feeling of pressure, and that's a healthy pressure. The pressure is, I want something that I do not have, and so that creates a certain level of unrest, which again I see as healthy, because it leads to the next step, which is, as a result of that pressure, I would like to take action that would lead to the manifestation. Let's take something very rudimentary, which most of us can relate to. It's like, okay, I don't have a romantic partner. I would like to have a romantic partner. So that desire for it creates a pressure, because there's an awareness that the thing that I want I don't have, and my desire is for that. The next step is beginning to contemplate, how am I going to manifest the individual? I can't just go out and pluck somebody from the universe that I find attractive and go, you're going to be my partner, because obviously that's stupid. Right? But so I have to create an environment whereby that person, by the laws of attraction, sort of enters into my space, and then I interact with them and communicate my desire for something beyond just friendship, and hopefully they have the same, and blah, 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 right? Well, through studying our reality, we can begin to understand why that has eluded us. And this is probably one of the hardest things, is that we take responsibility for the fact that I don't have the kind of relationship that I want. So what can I do to sort of smoothen out my internal belief system around that? If my belief system gravitates towards, well, it's just, there's no good people out there, or every time I try to make something good, I find these people who are kind of flaky, or whatever it is, I'm blaming something in the other person. I'm not yet ready to take the responsibility for that which I'm creating. And so there will be a tendency to feel powerless in that. Hello. Hi. There will be a tendency to feel powerless in that. And then what my experience when people have decided that that's, things are being done to them, then a high high degree of time, people look for validation for that and sort of bond on the idea that life's not fair and I try everything that I can and nobody helps me out and all this. And I don't think that's prudent because it doesn't actually lead to the transformation. Instead, the individual begins to examine, okay, what are my beliefs about relationships? And therefore, to what degree am I fulfilling those beliefs by what has shown up or what has not shown up? Now that leads to the next stage in transformation, which is the discomfort. The discomfort of seeing more clearly how I'm contributing to, the manifestations that I have made so far. I think that's a really great phase, but also it's a phase where it's very tempting to then disconnect from the process because it's painful. I mean, it's painful to go like, oh, all this time I had some sort of a belief within myself that was contributing to, the failure to manifest the things I want, and I have sort of blamed it on external factors. That creates a whole other level of pressure. So what a lot of people want to do right away is they want to, their ego is grasping for some way to diffuse that reality and feed another reality. And that other reality is like, no, this is as a result of my upbringing, this is as a result of, other people's lack of willingness to give or whatever it is. And again, I don't want to feel disempowered. As soon as I blame it on something else, I'm disempowered. So I want to take that harder road that goes, okay, what can I examine about my belief system? So coming back to the element of tolerance, if I have a low tolerance for discomfort, and if we sort of take a look at this what we began talking about, the polarity of like extremely tolerant or extremely willing to endure discomfort or having a lack of tolerance, understanding that those are varying degrees of to what degree I am willing to give of myself. You could look at it that way. So how much discomfort am I willing to push through? How much can I tolerate because of my desire for the end result that I see? And that part is always changeable. That part is always up to you. I've had many people over the years take my meditation course who declare themselves to be anxious people. They just go, well, I'm just an anxious person. And I don't agree with that. I mean, I'm not rude about it, but I try to gently bring forth the idea that having lived in an environment that was not stable leads somebody to be anxious a lot of the time, but that's not a permanent state of being. Anxiety versus relaxation, again, are these two poles which represent, I suppose, my perception of the safety of an environment. And if I perceive the safety of the environment to be very low, then my anxiety is very high. How does that change? Well, that's a really interesting, actually, study. It's like, is the environment unsafe, or am I perceiving it to be unsafe, and therefore anxiety is a form of defense against that? I think when you really are tuned in to the Christ force within, then there are situations that are unsafe. Certainly you could drive into neighborhoods and just like, you can feel a tension. It's not safe. There's just the way it looks and the way people are hanging around on the street corners and just the way they look at you. It's like this, they're looking at me like I'm some sort of they're a predator looking to see if they can take advantage. So that is legitimate to be anxious and go, I need to get out of here. If I walk into like a room like this and somebody's like, and I'm just very tense because I don't know what people are going to do or say, okay, that anxiety is something that's being generated within myself. And so therefore, there's a way to overcome that through consciousness, through beginning to tune into the reality of it and remove the filter that I'm perceiving reality through. To be fair and to be humble, let's say we're all perceiving reality through certain filters. And as we progress on this journey, hopefully, one by one, we remove the filters, or you could say God removes the filters, so that we can experience reality exactly as it is. And I call that Christ consciousness. And very simply, to see only that which is, without the embellishment of my emotional preferences, without my own personal fears or my own biases or my own intelligence getting in the way. I see and perceive reality exactly as it is. And that's a very liberating state because it doesn't impose a reality. It says, this is reality, now what are you going to do? in the principle of rhythm, everything sort of, you could say, what's the word? The pendulum swings from backwards and forwards, ebbs and flows in different rhythms. So that, the easiest way we see that is the day and the night comes, and that's just immutable. It's going to happen every day. The tides are going to float in and they're going to flow out. And everything in nature, I mean, even with the movement of the earth in relationship to the sun, in the sense that the sun seems to dip to the southern hemisphere and then it slowly, gracefully comes back to the equator and back to the northern hemisphere. And so there's rhythm to everything natural. Where this is applicable in our teaching today is in terms of your emotional state. If you begin to monitor your emotional state, you may start to notice that you do move from highs to lows and back. That you may move through states of, a feeling of great hope, and then that cycle starts to turn around and you move into a cycle that's, being tempted to move into a state of despair, and then maybe there's a longing. Why can't I just always stay in a positive state of mind? Why is there this kind of rhythm to it? I was trying to I was meditating and go like, why does that principle exist? Because it's sort of intriguing to me. I think it's a state of a natural state in whereby things are trying to balance themselves out. That's the closest thing that I got to. I can't declare that I know exactly, because these principles exist. I think they're the principles of the Creator. So we just kind of go, okay, how can I function within them, as opposed to go, why do they exist? I don't know. I'm not sure how prudent it is to spend a lot of time on why is this the case. Because they're considered immutable. The beautiful thing about human consciousness is that we can circumvent certain rhythms. We can curtail the time that we spend in the negative cycle through the application of consciousness. Through our understanding of the fact that, okay, my cycle is beginning to turn around, I would like to shorten the time in which I spend in the sort of the down cycle. That is absolutely possible. And it tends to be a lot easier to create the reality that you want when you're in an energetic cycle that is more upbeat, more positive. Just because people tend to respond better to you. The tonality of the messages you send out will have more of a magnetic quality. If you're enthusiastic and you're upbeat and you're feeling good, people tend to respond better to you. Not everybody. I mean, the one weird thing is that I saw this YouTube once about like the most attractive men to women were, number one, psychopaths. And this is not a joke. The psychopath, the sociopath, and the narcissist were considered, there's a flip side for men, so I don't want you to think I'm being hard on women, but if women perceived in the face of a man, like if they showed a bunch of pictures and perceived that the person was either a psychopath, sociopath, or narcissist, they were considered more attractive than sort of somebody who looked like they had their act together. And that seems kind of bizarre, right? But I guess in another sense, it's not that bizarre. And when you think about the idea that possibly by my love, I can bring this person to a state of goodness. There's something very primitively attractive about that. We know it's a little bit of a losing battle, right? If you're going to try to fix somebody with your love. From the male perspective, there was this element of, like, if they looked at I hate to use this term, but if they looked at a woman's picture and they thought that she was bitchy, that was like considered very, very attractive. I mean, just so you have a sense of the kind of world that we're living in, right? I mean, they make sense to me on some level. I mean, first of all, as a man, I go, I know why that's kind of attractive.
Why?
Yeah.
Right, I guess I'm the only, you're a guy too, right? You don't know?
No, I'm saying why also, but
Well, it has
you're the one on camera.
Right, okay. It's a little bit hard to, like, it's not a logical thing. It has to do with, first of all, the element of the challenge. There's an element to, the primitive side of a man that does not want a woman to just, like, throw themselves at their feet, does not want a woman that's all smiling and in love with you, very quickly. There's something about having to win over a difficult person. And to have that element within the relationship contributes to a sense of conquest that then turns into, when they're being sexual, there's a sense of, kind of animal dominance that occurs. Because you've sort of overcome this negative state of the person and they've surrendered to you. So
it's perceived.
Yeah, exactly. But the perception does lead to sort of the biological response, right? It's like sometimes another element that they talked about in this video was like, let's say if a guy comes into a bar and someone looks at him the wrong way, so he punches the guy in the face, and all the women go, that's the guy I want, right? Because there's something about the primitive side of that guy's going to protect me, as opposed to a mature and conscious person going like, that guy's got anger issues. He's probably going to be very difficult to be in relationship with. So consciousness trumps a lot of these things, but our world is not that far along in that sense. I mean, if you've ever been in a relationship with somebody who is quote-unquote like a bitch, it's very difficult. It's not that much fun. Maybe the initial conquest it provides an ego boost, but people who have that kind of emotional instability is just really draining. But
and then there are those of us who put the porcupine suit on so that we don't have to deal with showing our squishy insides.
Right. That's a piece too.
Right?
Yeah.
Right?
That's different than bitchy.
That just blows your mind.
Yeah.
When you get to the squishy part. Then you don't know how to deal with us.
Right.
Right?
I agree. I mean, and it's amazing how many relationships all of a sudden fall apart when somebody becomes vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that has to do with, this isn't really the subject for today, but I do find it really fascinating, is that all of a sudden there's a sense that I'm going to be responsible for the other person's emotional well-being. That creates a tremendous, I mean, I can tell you in men that creates a tremendous suffocating feeling if they're not particularly evolved or transformed. Because, first of all, it's not accurate, but sometimes the energy that, and this could happen both ways from a man or a woman, that somebody all of a sudden starts to like them, and then sort of the guard is dropped, and they begin to expose themselves more honestly. And there are some people in that moment that they surrender their energy as though, okay, you're my rescuer, you're my caretaker. And then the other person feels this tremendous sort of pressure to be responsible for the other person. And so then, because when I was doing tarot readings, there was many times when somebody was like, everything was going great, and then all of a sudden the person disappeared. Like, I don't even know what happened. And that was a lot of the times that was the case when the person just became very vulnerable, and the other person read that as this tremendous responsibility that they were not willing to take on. And so the relationship kind of fell apart, and the person was crushed because they just really poured their heart open, whether it was like one night they were hanging out. So relationships are very intriguing in that way, when you realize the sort of these primitive elements that drive people. What we want to do is we want to recognize the tendencies that are occurring, and through consciousness accentuate the positive ones and diminish the negative ones. The way to do that is a little counterintuitive. It has to do with examining your thinking function, your feeling function, and your will function. So you can think of your will function as your action function. In most people, these are connected in a way that's subconscious, I guess. In other words, something happens, I have an emotional reaction to it, or emotional response. It automatically triggers a way of thinking, and therefore I follow up with a course of action that is not necessarily conscious. Now, I'm primarily speaking in terms of negative experiences. So, for example, we'll continue on with the relationship thing. Let's say you're in the middle of a relationship with somebody, and they do something that hurts you. They don't respond to you in the way that you want, or they criticize you, or who knows what it is. And then, depending on your level of consciousness, you have a feeling. And let's say that feeling is negative, so right away that ignites a style of thinking, which is generally either protective or retaliatory or distancing or something that's protective. And then a course of action will typically follow. And if there's no interruption by consciousness, then I will tend to just follow those through, 1, 2, 3, and create probably something that later on I might look back and go like, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. I ended up taking an action to try to communicate to the person, that wasn't right, and so I'm going to wrong you back as a way to show you what's going on. And that leads to karmic problems for myself, as opposed to what some people think is like, well, it's up to me to neutralize it. In other words, somebody did something wrong to me, I got to do something wrong to them, and then we're even. That's not actually how it works. Somebody does something wrong to me, they have a karmic, let's say a karmic check mark on their roster, for lack of a better term. And they will receive, somewhere, they will receive a corresponding experience in order that they may see how their action affects the other person. But if I take it on myself to be the one who provides that for them, I've now, well, first of all, it's a lack of faith, because God will make sure that that happens. That's just the law of karma, is that which you put out will come back to you. I mean, we're going to talk about next week how you can actually get off the wheel of karma through grace and forgiveness. But for the most part, my experience has been, and there's a lot of nuances to it, but my experience has been, yeah, if you put out crappy stuff is going to come back to you, and hopefully that wakes you up so you kind of go like, oh, now I understand what happens when you're the recipient of, crappy actions. So of my own free will, I will no longer perpetuate those. I think in our culture and a lot of places in the world, we go, well, I have to be the one to strike back because my dignity is at stake, my self-respect is at stake, and the person needs to know that they did something wrong. This is the essence in a lot of things, in a lot of ways that I think makes the Christian teachings difficult. When Jesus says, no, you are to turn the other cheek. You are to love your enemy. You are to pray for those who persecute you, etc. And it's a very high consciousness to go to sacrifice my free will that says I want to strike back. Instead of doing that, I'm going to choose this other path of consciousness where I forgive the person. First of all, I know that the law of karma will be in effect, so the person will likely have to experience what they put out, but I'm not going to be the one to set that in motion. So I have to begin to now compartmentalize my feeling function, my thinking function, and my will, my action function. Ironically, success in the manifestation process happens when those three are aligned, congruent, but with consciousness. The prior model I discussed does not have consciousness, it's automatic. Somebody does something, I feel hurt, I start thinking negatively about them, I take an action against them, and I go, yeah, what's the problem? It's all done. Well, when you start to become conscious, you realize that, oh, that actually set a cycle of karma in motion. It didn't bring me any closer to resolution with the person. What brings you closer to resolution with a person typically is, a conscious approach to resolving conflict. So what we teach, or what I teach anyway, is first of all, meditation is the fundamental place where I begin to recognize the connections between my emotional interpretation of life and my mental interpretation of life. And I become very adamant about beginning to sort of pull those apart so that they're not automatically A happens and then I do B. That's a lack of consciousness that may be contributing to why things are very difficult for you to manifest. What's really hard is if your belief system is like, well, that makes sense. What I do makes sense. And we go like, okay, but are you yielding, are you manifesting that which you desire? Does your life look the way you would like it to look? And if they say yes, I go like, well, that's great. I mean, you can do whatever you want. And I don't typically fight against people going like, well, this works for me. I'm like, oh, that's cool. I mean, when somebody presented the idea to me that by knowing these universal principles and by studying yourself and by beginning to understand how you respond to your own emotional interpretation of things, you can gain tremendous amount of power because you approach that Christ consciousness of just seeing things as they are. I mean, a lot of the times when people do things that are quote-unquote negative towards me, I find it very rare that there's intention behind it, that there's a malicious desire to cause harm. A high degree of time is just unconscious on their part, that they're just acting from tendencies. For example, I'm an Aries, which means I tend to communicate in a very direct way. When I was younger, it was a little bit too blunt. Other people may find it a little bit, coarse, and a little bit insensitive, and a little bit selfish even, because you don't spend the time to soften it up for people. And that made a lot of sense to me. And as a result, I tried to make that adjustment. I'm not sure how I'm doing, but I'm striving for it. The other thing too is patience. I tend to be very prompt on moving on things, and I used to get very irritable when people did not. reciprocate. Well, I would honestly say now that it still bothers me, but the separation of the feeling function and the thinking function have allowed me to go like, okay, I have a feeling over the fact that somebody said they were going to send this over to me on Tuesday. It's now Thursday, and part of me wants to, there's a part of me that's almost like, well, I want to send an email that goes like, so how's that Tuesday thing coming along? Like a little bit of an edge to it, because, hey, you said you were going to do it. I guess your word doesn't mean anything. Like, those are all elements of myself that hopefully I've outgrown. I mean, I still feel the pressure of them, but I don't want to act on them because they don't actually lead to the result that I want. If I were to send that kind of caustic email, what's going to happen? You think the person's going to immediately go, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I'll send it right now. No. Likely, because if they don't have the separation of the feeling and the thinking function, they start to go, oh, what a jerk he is. Well, I'll send it to him next Tuesday. Or maybe not at all. So it becomes a spiral where you have to be conscious of how your actions are going to trigger other people. If they're not doing any of this kind of conscious work, if you take an action that has that edge to it, you can expect that the way they're going to interpret it is their feeling function, their thinking function, and their action function are going to be mostly unconscious. So what we're striving to do through our meditation practice is be able to recognize how do I respond once my emotions are triggered. I begin to study this flow chart as far as what I do. Because again, we're trying to interrupt this automatic rhythm that always happens. If you're somebody who tends to get down, tends to get depressed, sometimes gets a little bummed out, then this is a great study for you to recognize, okay, usually that it starts slowly and it sort of starts to culminate to a full-on state of bummer or depression or whatever. The mystery to solve it is always within ourselves. If we start to go like, well, the weather sucks and this isn't working out and I don't have enough money, it's like, okay, going back to our principle of polarity, how much tolerance do I have to actually make a change on that? And then if my mind goes, well, it's never going to change for this reason, that reason, we go, okay, so your thinking is sort of tied to the emotional experience, and therefore there's no sense of applying any will or any action because it's not going to happen. And then I always go, hey, in God all things are possible. Am I willing to learn how to get there? And that takes me to the principle of care, which is sort of the principle that guides all manifestation, in my opinion. To what degree are you willing to exert attention upon the thing that you want? To what degree do you care enough about the end result that you say you want, such that everything is going to align up? The way you think about it is from the perspective of possibility, and your willpower becomes extremely active in seeking out whatever is necessary to yield that result. And we were talking earlier before everybody got here in terms of, I have a place that I'm trying to rent out on James Island, and what I've discovered is a lot of people, when I bring up the concept of credit report, I'm just kind of shocked at how many people have not tended to that. Like it's clear that people have bad credit. And I just kind of, for myself, I am willing to sometimes, sort of hear somebody's situation. But in the most part, it's very risky to invite somebody into a house who's got a bad credit because they've demonstrated over time that they don't manage their finances that well. And surprisingly, it's almost universal that the stories that people tell, they did everything right and somebody screwed them over. And I just know that's not how it works. But I don't say anything because I'm not going to be a jerk about it. But when somebody's perspective is, I did everything right, and as a result of other people's actions, I'm now suffering, so we're in the victim mentality mode. And how is that going to change? Very little changes from that perspective. Because the factors that are causing my grief are all outside of myself. I'm doing everything right. When you take on the idea of like, okay, my credit score is now 550, but I can't really buy a house or I can't get a car unless I get at least closer to 650 or 7. And once I get over 750, now I get the best rates. How cool would it be to take that on? And what ends up happening when somebody gets very serious about that is they don't allow the emotional and the mental interference to start to go, that's going to be too hard, and it's never going to work out, and I feel so overwhelmed, and oh my God, there's going to be too much work. And you go, no, none of that is going to enter into my consciousness. I am going to methodically study, how do I get my number from 550 to 750? And it's going to happen. It's going to happen because the principle of care says when you apply care to the things that you want, and your will supports it, that there's the supernatural grace of the Lord that's going to support you in it. Now, one caveat that I would put in is if your care and your will are about something that is in harmony with the divine, then you tend to draw that grace. If you're like, well, I want to rule the world and I want to kill millions of people, I don't think you're going to find a lot of grace. However, you can still actualize that, as we've seen on this planet. You can, by your care, apply yourself to negative outcomes. And just because the rules are indifferent to what exactly you're trying to accomplish, you can accomplish those things. But how beautiful it is when you want to accomplish something that is pleasing to God, and you feel this draw of supernatural grace supporting you. Coming back to the beginning, how much discomfort are you willing to go through to examine the way that you think, to examine not so much the way that you feel, but how you respond to your emotional reactions. I don't teach that we should not feel angry, or we should not feel anxious, or we should not feel depressed. I don't think that's fair, because I've never met one person who can control that in a healthy way, meaning they can say, I don't feel anger. I just set up my being where I don't feel it. I mean, I think anger plays an important role to indicate when my dignity has been crossed. I feel like something has been done to me as a human being which violates my dignity, so I get angry. It's what I choose to do as a result of that anger that demonstrates where my consciousness is at. Recently in our Bible class and in this past Sunday's sermon, we talked quite a bit about Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is like the greatest spiritual challenge to so many people. I'm supposed to love all people except Donald Trump, because it's difficult. It's difficult to, well, first of all, what's our concept about love? Second of all, how do I love somebody who is doing things that I consider such a violation against my fellow brothers and sisters? I see it as a challenge in terms of like, how do I fulfill the model that Jesus is teaching and not exclude him from that? I think it's relatively simple. It's just to what degree I'm ready to sort of surrender this tightness that I have. My emotional response to the things that he may do. Over the weekend I saw this movie called Ben is Back. Has anybody seen that? Yeah. Okay. Good. So you see a woman who's just has so much love for her son, but her son's a drug addict. And the movie starts in the middle where you realize that the son has done a lot of horrible things that have caused the family a tremendous amount of grief over whatever the years that he's been an addict, lying, deceiving, and just, actually there's one person that he was doing drugs with that died as a result of the drugs that he provided. So you've got people in his history that hate this guy because they see him as tied to that. And yet you have this love of his mother that just like, she won't let him go. She won't dismiss him as a write-off because it's her son, and she can't disassociate from that love. And I believe that that's how God looks at all of us on this earth. He goes like, yes, this person is doing things that are just really embarrassing or painful or really hurtful, but I can't dismiss that person because it's my son. It's my daughter. And I think of Donald Trump in that way, that God's got to be going like, yeah, okay, I don't like what he's doing, but I saw him when he was a baby, and I saw the pains he went through, and I saw the challenges in his household, and I saw the privilege, and I saw the lifetimes of bad choices, but I can't disconnect from the fact that this is my son. And maybe one day there'll be an awakening. I think if we dismiss people and we go, this person is hopeless and is so vile that I cut them off from the possibility of that. For those of you who have kids, maybe you understand that in a deeper way. I don't have kids, but maybe you understand, like, no matter what they do, you can't dismiss them. It's not possible because not permanently, right. Yeah, they trigger, you see in the movie she gets angry and she gets frustrated and stuff, and I think we are the brothers and sisters of all of each other. And so we don't either have the right to just determine that this person is to be forever condemned or dismissed or put to death or whatever. I personally don't believe so. And if you have faith and you aspire to this consciousness, it's incredibly liberating. You know, when you understand that everybody's journey, everybody's soul's journey is kind of dictated by their karmic trail and the choices they make and stuff. And I think we were talking on Wednesday. Yeah, if I ran the country, I would run it differently than him. But I also understand, because I did come to this country illegally from Canada. You know, I was trying to make it in the music business. So I came and I figured, well, once I get here, I'll figure out my immigration status. And I wanted to bring my band with me, but they're like, no, how do we deal with the immigration? And I was just like, well, we'll figure it out. But they weren't willing to do that. And looking back now, I wouldn't recommend somebody do it the way that I did. My point is that by coming into the country and not following the rules, I was subject to whatever the consequences of that were. Now, I don't think it's particularly humane to separate the kids from the parents. And the way that the country is doing it right now is not something that I agree with. But I also know, like, if I don't pay my taxes, at some point, the government will do something in consequence to that. And so, in our Bible passage, there was a teaching that says you are to respect the authority of human institutions. That doesn't mean you have to agree that everything is done rightly, but if you want to protest against it, you don't go and smash windows at City Hall and expect to get a good result. I mean, it's just, people are not going to respond well to that. And the government doesn't have the face the way that we do, so you can't necessarily expect a human being, oh, I know you're really angry, so we'll forgive the window thing, and come on in and sit and tell me what your grievance is. You follow Gandhi. Gandhi was a master at nonviolent communication and protesting that led to the change that he ultimately sought, which is to have the British, leave the country and return it back to the Indian folks. It probably took a lot longer through the nonviolent means. And, Donald Trump is likely, well, maybe he'll be out after 4 years, maybe he'll get reelected. I don't know. It just sort of depends on what the people want. But it really is an expression of this rhythmic principle. We had 8 years of Obama, which was, very progressive and a lot of work towards trying things that we all related to. And I don't know everybody's political belief, and things have swung back the other way because this rhythm, this principle of rhythm is in effect. So likely at some point it's going to swing back the other way. But what if you could be liberated from feeling like you're pushed and pulled by that? I definitely think it's possible when your consciousness changes as far as your perspective on how to interpret the situation. Anyway, I think I want to leave time for people to chat and have discussion, so it's kind of the essence of what I wanted to share today.